Tonight we begin at the bottleneck, where the land tightens and the River Wye acts less like a waterway and more like a defensive trench. Chepstow Castle rises here, long, lean and predatory. Chepstow was built early, back when the Conquest was still in its beta phase. There is no romance here. This wasn't built for a princess. It was built for a checkpoint. It is a machine designed to answer a single question. Where does England end and Wales begin? The answer, exactly where this wall says it does. This is not a sudden skyline. It is a long stone argument. Every gate you pass is another sentence. Every tower is another point of order. And once you're inside, the argument is over. You lost. The fire is warm. The stone is ancient. There's nothing left to do but listen. Let the tide churn in the mud below. Let the history settle around you, and follow the flow of the Wye as it rushes past the oldest stone watchman in Britain. If you're going to build a machine to dominate a landscape, you first have to understand the engine that powers it. In the case of Chepstow, the engine is not the wind, nor the sun, nor the sweat of the peasantry. It is the tide. The River Wye at Chepstow is not a polite meandering stream. It is a hydraulic monster. It boasts the second highest tidal range in the world, a geological freak of nature where the water level doesn't just rise, it explodes upwards by 40 feet twice a day. At low tide, the river is a deep, glistening canyon of chocolate-brown mud, a defensive trench dug by God himself to keep the Welsh on their side of the border. At high tide, it transforms into a superhighway deep enough to float an ocean-going warship right up to the cliff face. For a military commander, this is the geography of dreams. It is a natural loading dock with a built-in defensive schedule. Whoever controls the limestone cliff overlooking this tidal elevator controls the gateway between England and Wales. They control the flow of wine, the flow of wool, and most importantly the flow of men with sharp sticks. It is the jugular vein of the borderlands, and for 1,000 years, if you wanted to bleed Wales, you started the incision here. But long before the first Norman mason looked at that cliff and thought about profit margins, the Romans were already here, and they were comfortable. Let's take a moment to appreciate what comfort looked like in the Roman hinterland of Venta Silurum, modern-day Caerwent just a few miles down the road. It wasn't the damp, drafty existence of the medieval era. It was underfloor heating. It was mosaic floors that felt warm against bare feet in December. It was bathhouses filled with steam and gossip, and villas where the wine came from Italy and the oysters came from the coast. Imagine a rainy Tuesday in 300 AD. Outside, the British weather is doing its best to be miserable, grey, wet and bone-chilling. But inside the villa, the Hippocus system is gently radiating heat through the floorboards. You're sitting on a cushioned couch, perhaps reading a letter from a cousin in Gaul, sipping a cup of warmed, spiced wine. The air smells of rosemary and wood smoke. It is a pocket of civilization, a cosy, engineered bubble of the Mediterranean transplanted into the mud of Britannia. The Romans understood that the ultimate expression of power isn't just a wall, it's the ability to be warm when everyone else is cold. But empires, like underfloor heating systems, eventually break down. By the time the 11th century rolled around, the villas were ruins, the baths were cold, and the Pax Romana was just a rumour. The landscape was waiting for new management. In 1066, the management arrived. They spoke French, they wore chainmail, and they were in a hurry. William the Conqueror, fresh from his victory at Hastings, looked west toward the Welsh border and saw trouble. The Welsh were not like the English. They didn't fight in shield walls that could be broken in an afternoon. They fought in the woods, in the rain, in the mountains. To hold this frontier, William needed a bulldog. He chose his cousin, William Fitzosbern. Fitzosbern was granted the lordship of Strigul, a name that sounds like a throat infection, but actually encompassed a vast, wealthy slice of the borderlands. Fitzosbern arrived at the cliff above the Wye in 1067, just months after the conquest. Most Norman lords in England were busy building timber Motte and Bailey castles, quick, dirty, wooden forts designed to stop a rebellion. They were the pop-up shops of military occupation. Fitzosbern, however, was playing the long game. He looked at the Welsh threat across the river, he looked at the limestone cliff, and he made a decision that would change British architecture forever. No wood. We build in stone. Now. But quarrying stone is slow. It takes time to cut, time to dress, time to haul. Fitzosbern didn't have time. He needed a fortress yesterday. So he did what any pragmatic builder on a deadline would do. He went to the local recycling centre. The recycling centre happened to be the ruins of Roman Venta Silurum. The Normans descended on the old Roman city like vultures. They didn't see historical monuments, they saw pre-cut inventory. They stripped the facing stones from the temples, they pried the bricks from the bathhouses, they looted the administrative centres. It was a massive state-sponsored scavenging operation. Carts groaned under the weight of the empire as they trundled down the road to Chepstow, carrying the bones of one civilization to build the skeleton of the next. If you stand at the base of the Great Tower today, the donjon, you can still see the evidence of this theft. It is one of the most striking, cynical and beautiful details in castle architecture. Running horizontally through the grey Norman limestone are bands of bright red tile. These are Roman bricks. They are the tegulae and imbrisses of a fallen superpower. You can almost see the fingerprints of the Roman potters who shaped them 700 years earlier, oblivious to the fact that their work would eventually end up shielding a French warlord from Welsh arrows. The Normans used them as bonding courses, levelling layers to keep their walls straight. It is a visual fossil of history, Roman engineering literally holding up the Norman Conquest. The construction of the Great Tower in 1067 makes Chepstow the oldest surviving post-Roman stone fortress in Britain. While the rest of the country was hiding behind wooden palisades, Fitzosbern was sitting in a stone hall that measured 100 feet by 40 feet. And let's talk about that hall for a moment. Let's indulge in the coziness of security. It is 1070. Outside, the wind is howling up the Wye Valley, carrying the smell of salt and mud. The Welsh are somewhere in the woods across the river, and they're almost certainly angry. But you are inside the Great Tower. The walls are 10 feet thick, a solid mass of rubble and Roman brick that no fire can burn and no axe can chop. Inside, the great hearth is roaring. The smoke drifts up to the high timber roof, the only wood in the place, creating a haze that softens the harshness of the stone. The walls are hung with tapestries, not just for decoration, but to stop the draughts. There are furs piled on the benches, wolf, bear, sheepskin. The tables are heavy oak, laden with bread, roasted boar and pitchers of ale. The dogs are sleeping near the fire, twitching in their dreams. It is a fortress, yes, but it is also a womb of safety in a hostile world. The brutish nature of the stone creates the possibility of the cosy interior. You can only truly relax when you know that the thing outside trying to kill you cannot get in. For Fitzosbern, this stone giant wasn't just a military outpost, it was a statement of permanence. A wooden fort says, "We are camping here." A stone tower says, "We live here now. Deal with it." The Great Tower of Chepstow was a psychological weapon aimed directly at the Welsh psyche. It rose from the white cliff like a man-made extension of the geology, topped with the red stripes of Rome. It was the gateway to Wales, but the gate was locked, and Fitzosbern held the key. But as strong as the stone was, the politics were brittle. Fitzosbern would die in battle just a few years later, and his son would lose the castle to treason. The rock would remain, but the names above the door were about to change. The tide was turning again, and the next wave of owners would bring their own ideas about how to dominate a river. To understand Chepstow in the late 12th century, you have to understand the neighbourhood. This was the Marcher lordship. a political twilight zone between the orderly feudalism of England and the chaotic, rain-soaked guerrilla warfare of Wales. The Marcher Lords were the medieval equivalent of Wild West cattle barons with a licence to kill. The King's Writ didn't run here. In the Marches, the law was whatever the guy with the biggest castle said it was. They raised their own armies, waged their own private wars, and treated the Geneva Convention, had it existed, as a humorous suggestion. In 1189, the keys to this dangerous kingdom were handed to a man who is arguably the only celebrity athlete in history who was also a competent politician, William Marshall. Marshall is a figure who defies modern comprehension. Imagine a cross between Muhammad Ali in his prime, a Navy SEAL commander, and the most charming diplomat at the UN. He started as a landless younger son and fought his way up, literally, by winning hundreds of tournaments. He made his fortune capturing other knights and ransoming them back to their families. He served 5 kings, signed the Magna Carta, and on his deathbed claimed to have captured 500 knights in his career. When he married Isabel de Clare and acquired Chepstow, he didn't just see a home, he saw a project. He had seen the cutting edge of military technology in the Crusades, the massive concentric castles of the Holy Land, designed to withstand siege engines that could throw a Honda Civic. He looked at Fitzosborne's old tower and thought, cute, but we need to upgrade. The upgrade was necessary because the neighbours were getting restless. The Welsh princes, men like the Lord Rhys ap Gruffydd, and later Llywelyn the Great, were not the disorganised raiders of the previous century. They were sophisticated, ruthless leaders who had realised that the best way to evict a Norman lord was to burn his assets. The Welsh didn't siege, they swarmed. They moved fast, struck hard, and vanished into the mist before the heavy cavalry could saddle up. Living in the marches meant living in a constant state of low-level anxiety. You needed walls that didn't just impress, you needed walls that worked. So, Marshall built the Great Gatehouse. This wasn't just an entrance, it was a filtration system for violence. It consisted of 2 massive round towers flanking a narrow passage. If you were an enemy trying to get in, you had to walk down a corridor where people were dropping rocks, boiling water, and crossbow bolts on your head from 3 different directions. It was a killing ground, designed to make the experience of entering Chepstow as short and painful as possible. But the centrepiece of this defence wasn't the stone, it was the wood. Let's take a cosy digression for a moment. Imagine it's 1195. You're a guard on the night shift. Outside, the Welsh weather is doing its thing, a horizontal sleet that stings the face and freezes the chainmail to your skin. The river below is a black churning void. But then your shift ends. You walk through the courtyard, stepping over the puddles, and you push open the heavy door to the guard room in the gatehouse. The contrast is instant. The air inside is thick and warm. A fire is crackling in the corner, smelling of apple wood and drying wool. There is a pot of pottage bubbling, a thick stew of oats, leeks, and maybe a bit of bacon if the steward was feeling generous. You unbuckle your sword belt, the leather creaking, and sit on a wooden bench polished smooth by 1,000 other tired soldiers. You wrap your cold hands around a clay mug of warm ale. That feeling, that profound, visceral shift from I am cold and might die to I am warm and safe, is the true purpose of a castle. It is a machine for creating coziness in a hostile world, and the only thing protecting that cosy fire from the sleet and the Welsh spears is the front door. And what a door it is. The doors at Chepstow are a miracle of survival. They are the oldest castle doors in Europe, still hanging on their hinges today. For centuries historians looked at them and said, they look old. In the modern era we stopped guessing and used science. Dendrochronology, tree ring dating, analysed the oak planks. The verdict? The trees were felled between 1159 and 1189. These are the actual doors William Marshall walked through. They have been shutting out the world for over 800 years. But Marshall knew that wood has a weakness: fire. If a Welsh raider couldn't batter the door down, he would pile brushwood against it, light a torch, and wait. To counter this, Marshall didn't just build a wooden door, he built a tank. The doors are cladded. This means the oak core is covered in a skin of iron, but it's not a solid sheet. That would rust and rot the wood underneath by trapping moisture. Instead, the blacksmiths created a lattice, a complex woven grid of iron straps held in place by nails. This was fire engineering. If you throw a torch at a plain wooden door, it burns. If you throw a torch at Chepstow's door, the iron lattice absorbs the impact and dissipates the heat. It prevents the flame from getting a good grip on the timber. It turns the door into a fire-retardant shield. The craftsmanship is staggering. Specifically, the mortise and tenon joints of the door are reversed. Usually you build a door so the structural frame is on the inside, safe from the enemy. Marshall's engineers put the heavy cross-bracing on the outside, then sheathed it in iron. This made the door harder to ram. If you hit it with a battering ram, you weren't hitting a plank. You were hitting the structural skeleton of the gate itself. For the next few centuries, the sound of Chepstow was the sound of those iron-bound doors slamming shut. It was the sound of the border closing for the night. Behind those doors, the Marshall family could eat their dinner, the soldiers could warm their feet, and the intricate, violent politics of the Middle Ages could carry on in safety. William Marshall died in 1219, a legend in his own time. He was buried in the Temple Church in London, but his true monument is standing in Wales. It is a pair of wooden doors, scarred by time, rusted by rain, but still hanging exactly where he put them. They are a silent testament to the fact that while knights and kings eventually rot, good oak, protected by good iron, is pretty much immortal. If William Fitzosborne built the bunker and William Marshall built the tank, Roger Bigod arrived to build the penthouse suite. By 1270, the Welsh marches were changing. The frontier was still dangerous, Wales wasn't fully conquered yet, but the business of being a lord was shifting from pure survival to aggressive asset management. Enter Roger Bigod, the 5th Earl of Norfolk. Bigod wasn't just wealthy, he possessed the GDP of a small nation kind of money. He was the medieval equivalent of a tech tycoon with a castle fetish. He was also a man with an ego large enough to create its own gravitational pull, frequently clashing with King Edward I over who exactly was in charge. When the king asked him to go fight in Gascony, Bigod famously refused. When the king threatened to hang him, Bigod essentially shrugged and said, "Good luck with that." He didn't come to Chepstow to hide behind thick walls, he came to show off. Under Bigod, the fortress underwent a radical transformation. The grim utilitarian barracks of the Marshall era were pushed aside. In their place rose the domestic range, a sprawling palatial block of apartments that clung to the edge of the limestone cliff. This was the McMansionization of the military outpost. Bigod punched massive windows through the river-facing walls. This was a flex. In 1100, a large window was a target. In 1280, it was a status symbol. It said, "I am so powerful, and my enemies are so frightened that I can afford to look at the view." He built private chambers, a grand hall, and kitchens capable of feeding an army of guests rather than an army of soldiers. Imagine it's a stormy autumn evening in 1290. Outside, the Wye is churning, a brown torrent smashing against the base of the cliff. The wind is stripping the leaves from the trees in the forest of Dean. But inside Bigod's private solar, the world is soft. The walls are not cold stone. They're plastered and painted with vibrant geometric patterns in ochre and red, mimicking the finest fabrics from the east. The floor is strewn with sweet-smelling rushes, lavender, meadowsweet and mint, that release a burst of fragrance every time you step on them. A fire burns in a hooded fireplace, an architectural novelty that draws the smoke away, leaving the air clear. You're sitting in a high-backed oak chair wrapped in a mantle of Flemish wool lined with squirrel fur. A page pours you a cup of wine. It is warm, it is dry, it is quiet. This domestic comfort was a weapon in itself. It demonstrated that the Lord of Chepstow had tamed the environment. He wasn't just surviving the frontier, he was gentrifying it. This brings us to the engine room of Bygord's lifestyle, the port and the cellar range. Chepstow wasn't just a castle, it was a logistics hub. It sat at the mouth of the Wye, the gateway to the Severn estuary. It became one of the busiest ports in medieval Britain, a bustling hive of export and import. The ships leaving Chepstow were heavy with the raw resources of the marches, timber from the forests, tanned leather from the cattle herds, and cured bacon. But the ships coming back were carrying the only thing Bygord cared about: French wine. The connection between England and Bordeaux in the 13th century was the Gascon wine trade, a maritime conveyor belt that kept the English aristocracy permanently pickled. Bygord imported vast quantities of claret, but getting hundreds of heavy oak barrels, tons, from a ship at river level to a cellar at castle level was a physics problem. The cliff is sheer, the tide is ferocious. You can't carry a 250-gallon barrel up a spiral staircase, so Bygord built a machine. At the river end of the domestic range, carved directly into the limestone cliff, is the Great Winch. This was medieval industrial engineering at its finest. It was a massive mechanical hoist, housed in a stone tower overlooking the water, a system of pulleys, ropes, and a windlass, likely powered by men walking inside a giant hamster wheel or cranking a heavy iron gear, allowed the dock workers to lift the cargo vertically. Picture the scene. It is low tide. The ship is grounded in the mud 40 feet below. The winch creaks and groans as the rope descends. The hook is secured to a barrel of finest Bordeaux. Heave. The rope tightens. The barrel swings free of the deck, dangling in the air, a pendulum of booze swaying against the grey limestone. Slowly, rhythmically, it rises up the cliff face past the seagulls until it vanishes into the sea gate of the castle. From there it was rolled directly into the cellar range. These cellars are still there, vast vaulted tunnels cut into the rock. They are cathedral-like in their silence. The air down there is permanently cool and damp, perfect for wine storage. Walking into them today, you can still smell the phantom scent of oak staves and vinegar. It was a warehouse of pleasure, a stockpile of liquid happiness designed to last through the long, dark Welsh winters. But Bygord didn't just want to drink well, he wanted to host well. To ensure his VIP guests understood their place in the hierarchy, he built Martin's Tower. This was the 13th century equivalent of the presidential suite. It stands at the southeast corner of the castle, a massive D-shaped tower that projects out from the curtain wall. The D shape was defensive, it deflected projectiles, but the interior was pure luxury. It had its own independent kitchen. It had large traceried windows with glass, an unimaginable extravagance. It even had its own private chapel carved into the thickness of the wall, so you could save your soul without having to walk across the rainy courtyard to the main church. Martin's Tower was a declaration. It said that Chepstow was no longer just a fortress of war. It was a palace of diplomacy. It was a place where treaties were signed over roast swan and French wine, where the brutal business of the marches was conducted in velvet rather than chainmail. By 1306, when Roger Bygord died, he had turned Chepstow into the envy of the kingdom. He had mastered the tide, drilled into the rock, and built a machine that could lift a party straight out of the mud. But ambition is expensive. Bygord died childless and heavily in debt to the crown. The castle passed to the king, and the golden age of construction ended. The wine would keep flowing, and the winch would keep turning, but the era of the Palace of the Marches was peaking. The future held less luxury and a lot more gunpowder. If the history of Chepstow up to this point was a heavy metal album, full of screaming fire and iron doors, The Tudor era is where the band decides to release an acoustic ballad about tax reform. For 400 years, Chepstow had been a weapon. It existed for one reason, because the people on the other side of the river wanted to kill the people on this side of the river. But in 1485, a strange thing happened. A Welshman named Henry Tudor won the English crown. Suddenly being Welsh wasn't a crime, it was a fashion statement. With the rise of the Tudor dynasty and the eventual Act of Union in the 16th century, the Welsh frontier effectively dissolved. The border didn't move, but the tension evaporated. The Marcher Lords, those semi-independent warlords who had ruled with absolute impunity, were stripped of their powers. The Wild West was tamed not by a sheriff, but by lawyers. Chepstow Castle faced an identity crisis. What does a fortress do when there is nobody left to fight? It became an office building. The ownership passed to the Somersets, the Earls of Worcester. These were not the rough-edged scrappers of the Norman Conquest. They were courtiers, politicians, and men who appreciated fine doublets and low interest rates. Their primary residence was the nearby Raglan Castle, a structure that looked like a castle but behaved like a palace. To them, Chepstow was the old family estate. It was valuable, but it was a bit draughty and old-fashioned. So they renovated. But this wasn't the military upgrade of William Marshall or the luxury expansion of Roger Bigod. This was the bureaucratic retrofit. Chepstow ceased to be a machine for war and became a machine for administration. The Great Hall, once the scene of war councils, became a law court where disputes over sheep grazing and property boundaries were settled. The towers, designed to hold archers and boiling oil, were converted into muniment rooms, storage lockers for deeds, wills and tax records. The garrison was fired, and in their place came an army of clerks, stewards and bailiffs. The sword was replaced by the quill. The roar of the winch was replaced by the rustle of parchment. If you look closely at the walls of the domestic range today, you can see the scars of this peace. The Somersets looked at the arrow slits, narrow vertical gaps designed to let you shoot a man in the eye without getting hit yourself, and realised they let in terrible light. So they smashed them open. They hired masons to punch large rectangular domestic windows through the defensive walls. They bricked up the murder holes. They installed fireplaces in the guard rooms. It was a structural admission that the war was over. They were turning a tank into a town hall. Let's step away from the grand politics and find a moment of peace in 1540. Imagine you're a junior clerk employed by the Earl of Worcester. Your job is to audit the wool exports from the Wye Valley, and it is Tuesday in November. Outside, the rain is hammering against the limestone, washing the dust of the Roman bricks down into the river. But you're inside one of the converted towers. The room is small, round and intimate. The arrow slit has been widened and glazed with thick greenish glass that distorts the view of the river into a blurry impressionist painting. The room smells of beeswax candles, dry ink, and the slight musk of old parchment. There is a brazier of charcoal glowing near your feet, keeping the chill of the stone floor at bay. You have a heavy woolen cloak draped over your shoulders. The only sound is the scratching of your nib against the paper and the distant rhythmic dripping of a gutter outside. It is a mundane existence compared to the knights of old. You will never charge into battle. You will never hold the bridge. But there is a profound, quiet comfort in the safety of administration. You are warm. You are paid. And the thickest walls in Britain are protecting you from nothing more dangerous than a draft. In the violent history of humanity, the ability to be bored at work is the ultimate luxury. This new, peaceful Chepstow became a destination for the VIPs of the age. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, visited the castle. It must have been a surreal moment. Here was the descendant of the very Welsh princes the castle was built to destroy, walking through the gates as the owner. The Red Dragon of Wales wasn't burning the castle down. It was flying from the flagpole. It was the symbolic end of 4 centuries of bloodshed. Later, Charles I would visit. We can imagine him walking the battlements, looking out over the Wye, perhaps discussing hunting or taxes with the Earl of Worcester. To Charles, Chepstow must have seemed like a relic of a barbarous past, a quaint fortification that had outlived its usefulness. He saw the large windows, the unguarded gates, the peaceful river commerce. He likely thought, "Thank God we don't live in those dark times anymore." He was wrong. The Tudor piece was a facade. The stone was softened, the arrow slits were bricked up, and the clerks were cosy, but the geology hadn't changed. The strategic value of the cliff hadn't changed, and deep in the political bedrock of England, the new fault line was fracturing, not between English and Welsh, but between king and parliament. The bureaucracy was ending. The gunpowder age was coming. For 150 years, Chepstow had been a sleepy government building. It was a place of ink stains, tax ledgers, and widened windows. But in 1642, the English Civil War tore the country apart, and the clerks were sent home. The castle was about to remember what it was actually built for. The tragedy of Chepstow in the 1640s is that it was a medieval fighter stepping into a modern ring. Its walls were designed to stop arrows and trebuchets. They were thick, yes, but they were vertical and brittle. Against the new god of war, gunpowder artillery, vertical stone walls are not defences, they are targets. The castle was held for King Charles I. The royalists looked at the massive doors of William Marshall and felt safe, but the parliamentarians, led by Colonel Thomas Morgan, didn't care about doors. They brought cannon. In October 1645, Morgan rolled his guns up to the walls. These weren't the unpredictable potguns of the Tudor era. These were siege engines that fired solid iron balls with terrifying kinetic energy. The Tudor renovations, those lovely large windows cut into the curtain wall, suddenly became structural liabilities. The stone fractured, the dust rose. The royalist garrison, realising that dying for the king was less appealing than living to fight another day, looked at the crumbling masonry and raised the white flag. The castle fell. Parliament took the keys. For 3 years, Chepstow sat under parliamentarian control. But the war wasn't over. It was just catching its breath. In May 1648, a royalist diehard named Sir Nicholas Keymes decided to do something incredibly brave and incredibly stupid. Keymes was a local heavyweight, a man of immense physical strength and zero compromise. While the parliamentarian governor was away, allegedly attending a meeting, Keymes and a small group of loyalists infiltrated the castle. They didn't storm it. They snuck in through the port wall entrance, overpowered the skeleton crew and locked the gates. In an afternoon, the key to South Wales was back in royalist hands. It was a humiliating black eye for Parliament. This annoyance attracted the attention of the man himself, Oliver Cromwell. Cromwell didn't have a sense of humour about these things. He marched his army to Chepstow personally. He stood before the walls, looked at Keymes' flag, and likely sighed the sigh of a middle manager dealing with a recurring problem. Cromwell didn't stay for the siege. He had bigger fish to fry in Pembroke, but he left his bulldog, Colonel Isaac Ewer, with very simple instructions. Do not negotiate, do not leave, smash it. Colonel Ewer was a man of his word. He set up his artillery train in the Dell, the deep valley that runs alongside the castle. He didn't peck at the walls, he hammered them. This was the industrial dismantling of a landmark. For days the sound of the Wye Valley was the rhythmic, deafening roar of cannon fire. The iron balls slammed into the base of the towers, pulverising the limestone into gravel. The medieval masonry, which had stood since Fitzosborne, began to slide into the ditch. Let's find a moment of peace before the end. We have no diary from this castle on this night, but if the Great Hall could speak, this might be what it would tell. It is the night of May 24th, 1648. The bombardment has paused for the evening because aiming cannons in the dark is a waste of good powder. Inside the Great Hall, the same room where Roger Bigod once served French wine, Sir Nicholas Keymes and his officers are eating dinner. The room is damaged. A stray shot has smashed the stained glass, so the window is boarded up with rough timber. The air is thick with the smell of sulphur, which never really leaves your clothes during a siege, and the dust of pulverised lime. But the table is set. They are eating hardtack and salted beef, perhaps washed down with the last of the ale found in the cellar. There is a fire burning in the grate, casting long, dancing shadows against the cracked plaster. For an hour the war is outside. They joke, they toast the king, they check the priming on their pistols. There is a grim intimacy here, the specific cosy camaraderie of men who know that tomorrow is going to be a very, very bad day. They are warm, they are fed, and they are together. In the face of oblivion, a shared meal is a form of defiance. On May 25th, the walls of the Lower Bailey gave way. The breach was open. Colonel Ewer's troops didn't march in, they swarmed. They poured through the gap in a wave of pike and musket smoke. Most garrisons would surrender at this point. The walls are down, the enemy is inside, the game is over. But Nicholas Keymes was not the surrendering type. He retreated to the inner defences, fighting room by room. The final stand didn't happen in a glorious duel on the battlements. It happened in the confusion and smoke of the courtyard. Keymes refused quarter. He fought with a ferocity that surprised even the parliamentarians. But a sword is no match for a firing squad. He was cut down in the dirt. With his death, the royalist resistance in Chepstow collapsed. The parliamentarians stripped the castle, disarmed the survivors, and looked at the battered ruin they had just conquered. The age of Chepstow as a fortress was effectively over. The cannons had proven that stone walls were obsolete. The castle had died with Keymes. It would never again be a home for knights, nor a palace for earls. It was now a prisoner of the state. But the state wasn't done with it. If walls can't keep an army out, they can still do a very good job of keeping one specific person in. The year is 1660. The experiment of the English Republic has failed. The party is over, the Puritans are out, and the merry monarch, Charles II, is back on the throne. For most people who had signed Charles I's death warrant back in 1649, this was a very bad time to be alive. The new king was hunting down the regicides with a vengeful efficiency. If your signature was on that parchment, the future usually involved being hanged, drawn and quartered, a process that is exactly as messy and uncosy as it sounds. But Henry Marten was different. Marten was a radical Republican, a chaotic intellectual, and a man who treated politics with a dangerous amount of wit. Legend has it that when he signed the king's death warrant, he flicked ink into Oliver Cromwell's face like a naughty schoolboy. He was the bad boy of the revolution. When he was finally captured and put on trial, he didn't beg. He argued. Perhaps because of his charm, or perhaps because he was seen as a harmless old lush, Charles II decided not to kill him. Instead, he sentenced him to life imprisonment in a remote fortress. The king looked at the map, pointed to the Welsh border and said, "Send him to Chepstow." Henry Marten arrived at Chepstow Castle not as a lord, but as a permanent guest of the state. He wasn't thrown into a dungeon. Dungeons are damp, dark and bad for the health of political prisoners you're trying to look merciful towards. Instead, he was given the keys to Bygard's Tower, the luxury suite built 300 years earlier. This became Marten's Tower, the name it still bears today. It was the ultimate golden cage. Marten had a suite of rooms. He was allowed to bring his wife, though, in typical Marten fashion, she rarely visited, preferring to stay home while he lived there with his mistress and servants. He had a fireplace, he had his books. He was even allowed to walk into the town of Chepstow under guard to visit the local gentry for dinner. But let's not mistake comfort for freedom. Imagine it is 1675. Marten is now an old man, 73 years of age. It is a winter evening. The wind is howling up the Wye Valley, rattling the shutters of the great windows that Roger Bygard had so proudly installed. Inside the tower it is warm. Marten is sitting in a high-backed chair upholstered in worn velvet. The fire is banking down, glowing red and orange. On the table next to him is a glass of wine, likely not the fine Bordeaux of the bygone era, but drinkable enough, and a stack of paper. Martin was a writer, a thinker, a man whose mind never stopped whirring. He dips his quill. He isn't writing laws anymore. He's writing anagrams. He's writing poetry. The room is silent, save for the crackle of the log and the distant rhythmic rushing of the tide outside. It is a cosy scene, a man, a fire, a glass. But then he looks at the door. It is thick oak. It is barred from the outside. He realizes that this warmth is the entire radius of his existence. He can hear the world, but he cannot touch it. The coziness is a sedative. He is a bird in a very expensive stone aviary. Martin lived in this tower for 20 years. Think about that timeline. He watched the seasons change on the Wye 80 times. He watched the tide rise and fall, 40 feet up, 40 feet down, over 14,000 times. The river became his clock. Every day the water rushed in from the Severn Sea, bringing ships, news and life. Every day the water rushed out, leaving the brown, glistening mud banks. The view from his window was a constant reminder of the flow of time and commerce, things he was no longer part of. He eventually died in the tower in 1680, at the age of 78. He was buried in the local church, but his name stayed in the tower. He had turned the guest palace of the 13th century into the most famous prison cell in Wales. With Martin dead, the castle fell asleep. The military utility was gone. The cannons were rusted. The roof began to leak. But in the late 18th century, a new army invaded. They were the Romantic tourists. The Napoleonic Wars meant that rich British aristocrats couldn't do their grand tour of Italy and Greece. Stuck on their own island, they looked around for something wild and ancient to look at. They found the Wye Valley. This was the birth of the Wye Tour. It was a packaged holiday for the Georgian elite. They would rent boats at Ross-on-Wye and drift downriver, sketching pads in hand, looking for the picturesque. A specific artistic quality of rough beauty. Chepstow Castle became a superstar. Artists like J.M.W. Turner arrived to paint the walls, not as military diagrams, but as soft, ivy-clad ruins bathed in golden light. They didn't care about the brutal logistics of the iron doors or the lethal geometry of the arrow slits. They cared about the vibe. They loved the way the sunlight hit the crumbling limestone. They loved the melancholy of the empty windows. William Wordsworth wandered through, composing lines about the tranquillity of the ruins. The castle had become a prop in a poem. The blood, the sweat, the pulverised lime of the Civil War bombardment, it was all sanitised into romantic decay. The brutal machine of Fitzosborne had become a picnic spot, and so we arrive at today. If you stand on the battlements of Chepstow now, the first thing you notice is still the smell. It is the sharp, saline scent of the mud. The castle is a monument now, managed by the state, preserved in a state of suspended animation. The Roman bricks are still red. The Norman limestone is still grey. The iron doors of William Marshall are still hanging there, daring you to try and burn them. The river is still doing exactly what it was doing in 43 AD. It carried the Roman galleys loaded with tile. It carried the Norman barges loaded with stone. It carried the medieval ships loaded with wine. It carried the Civil War boats loaded with cannon. It carried the Victorian steamers loaded with tourists. Now it carries kayaks and the reflection of the modern road bridge. For hundreds of years, people climbed these towers believing they were standing at the edge of the future. The Norman knight scanning the river for sails, the Tudor noble watching the road for royal messengers, the Civil War officer counting cannon in the valley, each came here carrying the weight of their own moment. Each believed history was about to turn. Now people climb these towers more slowly. They come to stand where others once stood, to look where others once looked, to feel what came before them.